Greetings from Journey with Us. Today I want to go back to chapter 1 of John's Gospel and read verse 14. And it reads, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." It's almost shocking to hear that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The testimony of the scriptures is that God is a holy God, a thrice holy God, holy, holy, holy. A God who cannot look at evil. His eyes are so pure. And it is shocking to hear this Word who was in the beginning, who was with God, who is God, has now become flesh. God's ultimate self-disclosure has now become flesh. When Word became flesh, God became man. In Christ we beheld the glory of God, full of grace and truth. But what is this glory? Moses in Exodus chapter 33 and verse 18 said, "Show me your glory." And this is what the Lord replied in verse 19. "I'll cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I'll proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I'll have mercy on whom I'll have mercy, and I'll have compassion on whom I will have compassion." And in chapter 34 of Exodus, reading from verse 5 on, you will see that even as Moses stands on Mount Sinai, we are told the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. So what is this glory? What is it that we have beheld, full of grace and truth? It is God. God's glory then is supremely his goodness, his grace, his mercy that he has shown to us in his Son. And John talks of this Word which became flesh, and he talks of him as someone who existed even before him. He is reiterating the fact that the Word's absolute primacy. And in verse 18 we read, in Christ, what do we read in verse 18? Let me read it for you. "No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." In Christ, God has made himself visible. "Anyone who has seen me," Jesus says, "has seen the Father." Chapter 6 and verse 46. Because the one who was with God has made him known to us. And what is John going to do? He is going to exegete or narrate this God who became flesh in the following chapters. But how does this apply to us as God's people, and especially during this hard time? Christ takes flesh and blood today through you and me, through his church, which is in the world but not of the world. We will look at that. We are the visible Christ, or as Paul says, we are the letters of Christ, 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 3. How then we ought to live? We ought to live as even as Christ lived. And what this word did, the word who was in the beginning was with God, who is God. The word left the splendor and glory of heaven and came to dwell among us. He became the light of redemption for his people, you and me. God became flesh in Jesus Christ so that he could die for us. He could offer us forgiveness and could call us back to himself. And that is the good news. Are we like Christ to our world, especially during this time when people seem so hopeless and so uncertain and so full of anxiety? Are we willing to get out of our comfort zone and be with the people that God needs us to be with? That is what God did. Even the Word that became flesh and made his home with you and me. It is this God that we want to remember during this time. It is this God we want to say we love you. It is this God that we want to give all our affections to. I want to thank you for listening and have a blessed day.